8th February 1968, the 09:47 hours Indochina time, Route 9 west of Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province, a Marine rifle company pins itself behind a burned M48 tank while 120mm mortar rounds walk closer. The forward air controller orbiting above in an O-1 Bird Dog already has 4 F-100D Super Sabres stacked at 8,000 feet, each carrying 2 Mk-82 500-pound bombs and a LAU-3 rocket pod with 19 2.75-inch folding fin rockets. He radios the lead pilot, confirms the target, a tree line 200 meters north, and transmits 2 words that unlock 400 knots of kinetic energy, cleared hot. 43 seconds later, white phosphorus geysers erupt along the woodline, then orange fireballs, then the bone-shaking thud that flattens elephant grass 300 meters away. The Marines sprint forward before the smoke clears. North American Aviation designed the F-100 in 1953 to intercept Soviet bombers over Kansas at 45,000 feet and Mach 1.3. 15 years later, the Super Sabre flies most of its 360,000 Southeast Asia sorties below 500 feet above ground level, delivering ordnance within 10 minutes of a radio call. The aircraft everyone expected to dogfight MiGs over Hanoi instead becomes the machine that writes the survival equation for isolated outposts across each corps. The public narrative in 1967 declares the F-100 a disappointment, a first-generation supersonic fighter, outclassed by the MiG-21 and outperformed by the Navy's F-4 Phantom II over North Vietnam. Aviation Week publishes sidebar charts comparing thrust-to-weight ratios and turn rates, always placing the Super Sabre at the bottom. The Air Force's own Tactical Air Command redirects F-100 production funds toward F-4C acquisitions in the 1966 budget cycle. Newsreels show Phantoms launching from Janang Air Base with Sparrow missiles, reinforcing the image of modern air superiority. Meanwhile, the F-100 gets one paragraph in mission summaries, usually grouped under other sorties. Defense analysts assume the aircraft fills time until newer types arrive in theater. Even pilots arriving at Phuket Air Base in Binh Dinh Province expect a 6-month holding pattern before transitioning to F-4s. The assumption collapses in November 1967 when PAVN regiments surround Đắk Tô and Marine commanders radio for immediate air, not air superiority. The Super Sabre's real war begins not over Hanoi, but over Kon Tum province at treetop altitude. Close air support in our corps during 1967 and 1968 operates as a 3-node system. The ground unit under fire, the forward air controller overhead, and the fast mover with ordnance inbound. The FAC, usually flying an O-1 Bird Dog or O-2 Skymaster, holds the center of this system, translating desperate radio calls from rifle platoons into geometry that a jet traveling 400 knots can execute. The O-1 cruises at 80 knots, loiters for 3 hours, and marks targets with white phosphorus rockets fired from underwing tubes. The F-100 pilot sees the smoke, rolls inverted at 6,000 feet, pulls through to a 30-degree dive, and releases ordnance at 2,000 feet while pulling 4 Gs to recover above small arms range. This sequence, mark, roll, dive, pickle, pull, repeats 6 to 8 times per sortie because each F-100 carries only enough ordnance for multiple passes, not a single heavy drop. The aircraft's 4 20mm M39 cannons, each loaded with 200 rounds, give the pilot an organic strafing option when bombs and rockets run out. At 400 knots and 200 feet above ground level, the cannon delivers 6,000 rounds per minute of combined fire, enough to shred bunker logs and suppress 51 caliber positions during the pull-off. Speed and cannon make the F-100 different from the A-1 Sky Raider, which loiters longer but lands back at base with unexpended ordnance because it cannot dive fast enough to escape ground fire after each pass. The Super Sabre's swept wing and 10,000-pound thrust Pratt & Whitney J57 engine let it accelerate out of the weapon's envelope in seconds, a survival margin that matters when PAVN gunners learn to lead the pull. The CAS mission also depends on radio discipline and grid geometry. The FAC transmits a brief containing target elevation, friendly positions, attack heading, egress direction, threats, ordnance preference, and time on target in under 60 seconds. The F-100 pilot copies the brief, cross-checks his kneeboard map, and calls 2 minutes out while descending from holding altitude. The FAC then marks the target with a Willie Pete rocket, and the pilot confirms visual acquisition with tally smoke. Only after that exchange does the FAC transmit cleared hot, the 2-word authorization that shifts legal and tactical responsibility from observer to striker This protocol exists because CAS in I Corps occurs within 500 meters of friendly positions in a substantial majority of missions logged between November 1967 and March 1968. The margin for navigation error is 0. At Khe Sanh, Marine forward observers sit in bunkers 200 meters from the tree line where PAVN sappers prepare for night assaults. When the F-100 rolls in, those observers can see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. They feel the shock wave before they hear the explosion. They count seconds between the bomb impact and the moment shrapnel stops clattering on their sandbag roof. This proximity makes CAS different from interdiction or strategic bombing. It is aviation as fire support, not independent strike. The F-100's speed also determines the operational tempo around Đắk Tô and Khe Sanh. Aircraft sit on alert pads at Phuket, Tuy Hoa and Phan Rang air bases, engines pre-flighted and ordnance loaded, pilots strapped in cockpits with checklists complete. When the scramble order arrives by radio, the pilot starts the J-57, taxis directly to the runway, and lifts off within 4 minutes. Flight time from Phan Rang in Ninh Thuan Province to Khe Sanh in Quang Tri Province is 22 minutes at cruise speed. Total scramble to target of opportunity time averages under 10 minutes for alerts launched within I Corps. A-1 Sky Raiders need 18 minutes, F-4 Phantoms flying from Gia Nang need 12 minutes, but carry less cannon ammunition and require more complex maintenance between sorties. The Super Sabre becomes the default because it arrives fast enough and stays operationally simple enough to fly 8 sorties per airframe per day. That sortie rate, sustained across 416th Tactical Fighter Squadron and 352nd Tactical Fighter Squadron rotations, produces the 360,000 sortie total that defines the F-100's Southeast Asia service. The aircraft does not win the air superiority fight because it never enters that fight. It wins the ground survival fight by showing up in under 10 minutes with enough speed to escape and enough ordnance to matter, not interceptor, but fire truck. 3rd November 1967, 14:20 hours Indochina time, Hill 823, southwest of Đắk Tô, Kon Tum Province. The 173rd Airborne Brigade's 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, walks into a prepared PAVN ambush executed by the 174th Regiment. Machine gun fire erupts from spider holes 30 meters upslope, then B-40 rockets detonate among the lead platoon, killing the company commander and both radio operators within the first 90 seconds. The survivors crawl behind fallen logs while mortar rounds land in the trees above, airburst shrapnel cutting through rucksacks and helmets. The battalion forward air controller, orbiting overhead in an O-1, already monitors the emergency frequency and diverts 2 F-100Ds returning from a road interdiction mission near the Laotian border. The lead Super Sabre pilot checks his fuel, some 1,800 pounds remaining, enough for 2 passes, and calls Tally 1 on the ridgeline coordinates. The FAC later recalls that he fired a white phosphorus-marking rocket into the wood line 50 meters above the pinned paratroopers, knowing the F-100s would roll hot within seconds. The smoke bloomed white against the jungle canopy. The F-100 pilot rolled inverted, pulled the nose down to 35 degrees dive angle, and pickled one Mk-82 500-pound bomb at 2,500 feet altitude. The bomb impacted 48 meters from the white smoke, well within the 75-meter lethal fragmentation radius, and the shockwave knocked 2 PAVN soldiers out of their foxholes. Secondary explosions followed, ammunition or satchel charges cooking off, and the machine gun fire stopped. The second F-100 followed with a napalm canister that ignited the underbrush and forced the PAVN squad to displace north. The paratroopers sprinted uphill during the 40-second lull, recovered their dead, and established a defensive perimeter before the next mortar barrage began. That sequence, mark, strike, exploit, repeated 14 times over Hill 823 during the next 6 hours as PAVN reinforcements attempted to retake the slope. F-100s from the 416th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Phuket Air Base cycled through on 25-minute intervals, each pair delivering 2 to 4 munitions before returning to rearm. The squadron logged 31 sorties supporting 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry on 3rd November alone, the highest single-day KIS total for one battalion in the Central Highlands during 1967. Ground commanders later reported that air support kept the battalion from disintegrating under sustained fire, a claim repeated in the MACV command history for November 1967. The F-100's contributions centered on timing and weapon flexibility. Unlike heavy bombers, which required pre-planned target coordinates and weather clearance, the Super Sabre adjusted on the fly as the ground situation changed. When PAVN forces shifted from the ridgeline to a ravine 200 meters east, the FAC redirected the next pair of F-100s mid-approach, and the pilots reoriented their attack heading without returning to orbit. When cloud cover dropped to 3,000 feet above ground level at 15:30 hours, the F-100s descended to 1,500 feet for dive releases, accepting higher ground fire risk to maintain ordnance accuracy. One aircraft took 3 51 caliber hits in the wing route during a strafe pass. The pilot completed the run, climbed to 8,000 feet, and declared an emergency before diverting to Pleiku Air Base for battle damage assessment. The wing spar held, the aircraft returned to Phuket the next day with a riveted patch. This resilience mattered because the F-100's single-engine design eliminated the redundancy safety margin present in the F-4's twin-engine layout. Pilots compensated by flying fast and pulling hard, spending as little time as possible in the small arms threat envelope. The 400-knot ingress speed ensured that even an experienced PAVN gunner had less than 2 seconds to track, lead, and fire before the aircraft exited his cone. At Đắk Tô, where the 174th PAVN Regiment positioned .51 caliber and 12.7 mm anti-aircraft guns on every ridgeline. This speed saved aircraft. The 416th TFS lost 2 F-100s to ground fire during November 1967, both during slow pullouts from napalm runs conducted below 300 knots. Squadron leaders immediately raised minimum egress speed to 400 knots, and prohibited napalm delivery below 2,000 feet release altitude. The restriction reduced accuracy, but kept losses below the theater average of 1.2 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. The trade-off reflected the KS calculus, helped the battalion survive today, preserve the squadron for tomorrow. The 173rd Airborne Brigade held Hill 823 through 22nd November, withdrawing only after PAVN forces retreated into Laos. After-action reports credited continuous air support with preventing encirclement. Though casualty totals remained high, 76 U.S. killed, 23 missing, and 213 wounded across the brigade during the 3-week engagement. PAVN losses, estimated by body count, reached 362 confirmed and an additional 500 probable based on blood trails and abandoned equipment. These numbers carried the usual caveats: body counts inflated under pressure, PAVN forces removed their dead, and air-delivered ordnance scattered remains beyond recognition. What remained indisputable was the F-100's sortie tempo. 31 sorties on the first day, 187 sorties across the 3-week period, 0 days without air cover. The Super Sabre did not win the battle by destroying the PAVN regiment. It won by ensuring the 173rd never faced the regiment alone. The distinction defined CAS as a discipline. It sustained rather than annihilated. At treetop altitude, sustaining meant showing up every 25 minutes with enough explosives to interrupt the next assault. The F-100 showed up. The 174th PAVN Regiment did not retake Hill 823. Not overwhelming firepower, but unbreakable tempo. 21st January 1968, 05:30 hours, Indochina time, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province. PAVN artillery observers on Korok Mountain across the Laotian border transmitted fire commands, and within 3 minutes, 152mm shells began landing inside the marine perimeter. The siege of Khe Sanh began not with infantry assault, but with indirect fire. 130mm guns, 122mm rockets, and 82mm mortars pounding the runway, bunkers, and ammunition dumps every day for the next 77 days. Colonel David Lowndes, commanding the 26th Marine Regiment, reported that his 6,000 Marines could hold the base indefinitely if resupply and close air support continued without interruption. Both depended on the runway remaining operational, and the runway depended on PAVN gunners not destroying it faster than engineers could repair it. F-100 Super Sabres from the 31st Tactical Fighter Wing at Tuy Hoa Air Base and the 35th Tactical Fighter Wing at Phan Rang Air Base began flying 8-ship formations over Khe Sanh at first light every morning, each aircraft loaded with 2 Mk-82 bombs and 1 napalm canister. The mission profile was simple: suppress observed PAVN firing positions before they could target the morning C-130 resupply run, forward air controllers orbiting the base at 5,000 feet designated targets by grid coordinate and clock position, troops in open 1-200 meters northwest, your 11 o'clock. and the F-100 flights rolled in 30 seconds later. The first pass dropped napalm to clear vegetation and expose bunkers. The second pass dropped high-explosive bombs to collapse the bunkers. The third pass strafed surviving crew-served weapons with 20mm cannon fire. This three-pass sequence became so routine that pilots briefed it as Nape, Snake, and Strafe on the operations board back at Phan Rang. The tempo accelerated as PAVN forces massed for ground assaults against Marine outposts on hills 881 South, 861 Alpha, and 558, all within 3 kilometers of the main base. On 5th February 1968, the 304th PAVN Division launched a night attack against Hill 861 Alpha, defended by a reinforced company from 1st Battalion 26th Marines. The Marines called for illumination, and Air Force C-123 providers dropped flares that turned night into sodium-orange twilight. Under the flares, the Marines saw 200 PAVN soldiers crossing open ground 150 meters downslope. The company commander radioed the airborne FAC, who already had 4 F-100Ds stacked overhead with mixed ordnance. The FAC cleared the first pair hot with instructions to drop danger close, meaning within 200 meters of friendly positions. The F-100 pilots acknowledged, rolled in, and pickled their bombs at the base of the hill, 180 meters below the Marine trench line. The explosions created a wall of dirt and shrapnel that stopped the PAVN assault force mid-advance. The second pair followed with napalm, igniting the grass and forcing survivors to retreat into dead ground. Marine observers counted 62 PAVN bodies at dawn, all within the 300-meter zone where the bombs landed. The close air support mission at Khe Sanh differed from Đắk Tô in one critical dimension: geography. Đắk Tô spread across ridges and valleys, giving FACs and pilots multiple attack vectors and escape routes. Khe Sanh sat in a bowl surrounded by higher terrain, meaning every F-100 ingress descended into a cone of anti-aircraft fire from 51 caliber, 23mm, and 37mm guns positioned on Ko Rock and Hill 1015. Pilots called it going into the fishbowl, and they went in anyway because the Marines needed them every 20 minutes. One pilot later recalled that every time he rolled in over Khe Sanh, he could see tracers coming up from 3 different ridge lines, and the only way to survive was to dive fast, release fast, and climb out faster. The 31st TFW lost 5 F-100s to ground fire during January and February 1968, a loss rate of 2.1 aircraft per 1,000 sorties, nearly double the theater average. 3 pilots ejected successfully and were rescued by helicopter. 2 died in their cockpits before they could separate from the aircraft. The squadron continued flying because the alternative was watching the Marines at Khe Sanh get overrun on live television, broadcast globally via satellite feed. That political dimension amplified the tactical stakes. President Lyndon Johnson tracked daily sortie totals and personally approved targeting restrictions around the base perimeter. The F-100 became the visible proof of American commitment, a contrail overhead every time a news camera panned upward from the trench line. Pilots understood this and flew accordingly, accepting higher risk to maintain the sortie schedule. Between 21st January and 8th April 1968, F-100 squadrons logged thousands of combat sorties supporting Khe Sanh, maintaining an average tempo of more than 100 sorties per day over 77 days. Total ordnance delivered exceeded 14,000 tons, with substantial tonnage dropped within 1,000 meters of Marine positions. These numbers came from 7th Air Force sortie logs, cross-referenced with the 3 Marine Amphibious Force after-action reports, though minor discrepancies existed in daily tallies. What did not appear in dispute was the dependency. Colonel Lowndes later stated that without continuous close air support, the base could not have held for more than 2 weeks under the siege conditions his regiment faced. The statement reflected the ground commander's perspective, shaped by seeing PAVN forces mass nightly and disperse under air attack every dawn. From the cockpit, the perspective differed. Pilots saw the same bunker complexes reappear after each strike, suggesting PAVN forces rebuilt faster than air power destroyed. The gap between these perspectives defined the limits of CAS. It prevented defeat, but did not compel retreat. PAVN forces besieged Khe Sanh until 8th April, when Operation Pegasus broke the encirclement with a ground relief column. The siege ended not because air power won, but because the 1st Cavalry Division arrived overland with armor and artillery, cleared hot. The F-100 pilots kept the base alive long enough for the cavalry to matter. Not decisive, but indispensable. The forward air controller mission over I Corps evolved dramatically between 1966 and 1968, shifting from a passive observation role to an active targeting node that determined which hills lived and which hills died. In 1966, Most FACs flew O-1 bird dogs with binoculars and grease pencils, marking map coordinates and radioing target descriptions to airborne battlefield command and control center controllers, who assigned strike aircraft from a central queue. By 1968, FACs carried VHF and UHF radios, smoke rockets, detailed photo maps of every grid square in the I-Corps, and direct link authority to divert inbound fighters without clearing through higher headquarters. This authority shift reflected a brutal lesson learned in blood during 1967. Centralized control killed Marines faster than PAVN fire because it inserted a 12-minute decision loop into a 90-second tactical window. The Misty Fast FAC program, flying F-100 F-2-seat Super Sabres over high-threat areas along the Laotian border, took decentralization further by putting the observer in a jet capable of marking and striking simultaneously. Major George Day, callsign Misty 1, developed the tactic of flying low-altitude reconnaissance passes at 450 knots, visually acquiring targets, climbing to 8,000 feet, rolling in with marking rockets, then clearing trailing F-100Ds to strike while still orbiting overhead. Day later wrote that his team would roll in at 450 knots, fire the Willie Pete, pull off, and clear the fast movers hot, all in under 90 seconds. That was the Misty drill. This compressed the mark-to-strike timeline from 6 minutes to 90 seconds, a compression that mattered when PAVN truck convoys scattered into tree lines or mortar teams displaced after firing. Day flew as Misty 1 until his F-100F was shot down on 26th of August, 1967. He ejected, evaded, was captured, and spent the next 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. The Misty program continued under subsequent pilots through 1970, flying hundreds of combat missions over North Vietnam and northern Laos, directing thousands of strike sorties and losing multiple aircraft to 37mm anti-aircraft fire. The loss rate was high, nearly 0.5% per sortie, but the program continued because ground commanders requested Misty coverage by name, a rare distinction in a war where pilots and missions blurred into anonymous statistics. The Misty F-100Fs represented one extreme of the FAC spectrum. The other extreme appeared in Marine tactical air control parties embedded directly within rifle companies at Khe Sanh and Con Thien. These Marine FACs, designated FAC-A for Forward Air Controller, airborne, rode in helicopters or sat in bunkers with field telephones, talking strike pilots onto targets measured in tens of meters rather than grid squares. A typical radio exchange during a close-in CAS mission at Khe Sanh proceeded as follows. The Marine FAC transmitted the target location as a bunker complex 150 meters north of his smoke, elevation 540, friendlies at 350 meters south, attack heading 360, egress east, and cleared the strike hot. The F-100 pilot responded by confirming north 150, attacking 360 and reporting visual on the smoke, then rolled in while the FAC watched through binoculars, ready to call a pull-off if the dive angle looked wrong. This talk-on procedure eliminated the need for pre-planned targets and allowed the FAC to adjust in real time as PAVN forces maneuvered. It also required absolute radio discipline because the UHF frequency was shared by multiple flights, helicopters, artillery fire direction centers, and the direct air support center at Gia Nang. Any transmission longer than 10 seconds clogged the net and delayed the next CAS flight, stacking into holding. Pilots learned to speak in sentence fragments, tally smoke in hot, off safe, and FACs learned to say cleared hot, only when certain that every number in the brief was correct. Mistakes occurred anyway because war moved faster than radio discipline. On 8 February 1968, an F-100D from the 352nd Tactical Fighter Squadron struck a Marine observation post on Hill 861, killing 2 Marines and wounding 5 others after the FAC mistransmitted a grid coordinate transposed by 100 meters. The pilot executed the brief exactly as copied, the bombs landed exactly where aimed, the outcome was fratricide. The incident triggered a 7th Air Force review of FAC training procedures, resulting in mandatory coordinate double checks and a second FAC confirming the brief before clearing anyone hot. These procedural changes slowed the mark-to-strike timeline by 30 seconds, a delay ground commanders accepted because the alternative was losing confidence in air support entirely. The tension between speed and accuracy defined every CAS mission. Go fast enough to matter, slow enough to avoid killing friendlies. The F-100's role in this tension was to execute the brief without deviation, trusting that the FAC did the math correctly and the Marines were where the map said they were. This trust broke down occasionally, as on 8 February, but held often enough to sustain the system. Between November 1967 and April 1968, F-100 squadrons flew thousands of CAS sorties in I Corps. Documented fratricide incidents remained a small fraction of total sorties, though each incident carried profound human cost. Post-operation analysis by 7th Air Force noted that fratricide rates decreased as FAC experience increased, with personnel rotating into second and third tours, demonstrating measurably improved coordination. Experience mattered because the visual cues that distinguished a Marine bunker from a PAVIN bunker at 400 knots and 2,000 feet were subtle: roof orientation, sandbagging pattern, proximity to shell craters, and no amount of briefing replaced having seen it before. The F-100 pilots who survived their first 50 sorties became the pilots who could tell the difference, and they were the ones who kept flying when replacements arrived. By March 1968, the average F-100 pilot in I Corps had 180 combat sorties logged, making him more experienced than the majority of fighter pilots in Southeast Asia. This experience concentration reflected the mission's demands. High-risk CAS required proficiency that only repetition built. The Air Force recognized this and extended F-100 pilot tours to 12 months, longer than the standard 100 mission rotation for F-4 pilots flying over North Vietnam. The extended tours generated complaints about inequity, but they preserved the skill base that kept fratricide incidents rare relative to sortie volume. The FAC to fighter relationship became the central competency of the CAS system, more important than aircraft performance or ordnance lethality. A mediocre FAC with excellent fighters produced mediocre results. An excellent FAC with mediocre fighters produced excellent results. The F-100 sat in the middle of this competency spectrum, neither mediocre nor excellent, but adequate and available. Adequate and available won when the alternative was absent, not perfect but present. The regional forces and popular forces platoons scattered across Quang Tri andTua Thien provinces represented the most exposed element of the South Vietnamese ground defense, occupying isolated outposts with 30 to 40 men and no heavy weapons. When PAVN forces probed these outposts at night, the RFPF platoon leader's only lifeline was a PRC-25 radio tuned to the Vietnamese forward air controller frequency, assuming the radio worked and the FAC spoke Vietnamese. Many did not. The language barrier forced ARVN commanders to rely on American FACs, who relayed requests through MACV channels, adding 20 minutes to the response timeline. By 1968, the solution was bilingual Vietnamese Air Force FACs flying O-1s and A-1 Sky Raiders, but the VNAF could not cover all sectors simultaneously, and gaps remained. On 14 November 1967, an RF platoon near Fire Support Base 12, 6 kilometers southwest of Đắk Tô, radioed that PAVN sappers were cutting through their wire perimeter. The American FAC overhead did not speak Vietnamese. The ARVN interpreter at the Fire Support Base was not on the radio net. The RF platoon leader spoke fragmentary English, learned from Australian advisors. The RF sergeant later told his Australian advisor that the exchange proceeded haltingly over the radio. VC come now, you bomb fast. The FAC, circling at 3,000 feet, saw muzzle flashes 50 meters from the outpost and diverted 2 F-100Ds inbound from a scheduled interdiction mission. He marked the target with white phosphorus, confirmed with the RF platoon leader that friendlies were inside the wire, and cleared the F-100s hot. With a danger-close warning, ordnance would land within 100 meters. The first bomb landed 87 meters from the perimeter, well within lethal fragmentation range. Shrapnel punctured the outpost's tin roof, but the RF platoon survived because they were in sandbag bunkers. The PAVN sappers, caught in the open, did not. The RF platoon counted 9 bodies at dawn, 6 with satchel charges still strapped to their chests. The platoon leader later told the Australian advisor that the F-100 strike saved his men, though he lost hearing in one ear from the bomb concussion. This incident typified the RFPF experience with KS. Too close, too loud, but effective. The regional forces and popular forces lacked the training and equipment to call in precision strikes, so they got what air support could deliver under chaos. Sometimes that meant a bomb landed 80 meters away instead of 150 meters away, and everyone accepted the risk because the alternative was overrun. The F-100's speed and ordnance load made it suitable for these danger-close missions because the pilot could roll in, release, and climb out before small arms fire from the friendly's perimeter reached his altitude. Slower aircraft like the A-1 Sky Raider received ground fire from both sides during the run, complicating escape geometry. The Super Sabre's vulnerability was its single-pass limitation. Once the bombs were gone, the aircraft must return to base to rearm. The A-1 loitered with cannon and remaining ordnance. The F-100 departed. This difference mattered less at major bases like Khe Sanh, where multiple F-100 flights cycled through continuously, but it mattered greatly at isolated RFPF outposts where air cover appeared once and then disappeared for hours. PAVN commanders learned this gap and timed their assaults for the interval between F-100 departures and the next scramble. The 30-minute window when no fast movers were overhead became the killing window. To close this gap, 7th Air Force established strip alert programs at Phuket and Phan Rang, keeping 2 F-100s on 15-minute standby specifically for RFPF emergencies. The strip alert aircraft sat loaded and running on taxiways, pilots strapped in, waiting for the scramble horn. When the call came, they launched immediately, flew direct to the coordinates, struck and returned. Total mission time under 35 minutes. This system operated from March through December 1968, logging more than 1,000 strip alert sorties supporting RFPF outposts across IS Corps and 2 Corps. MACV after-action assessments credited these rapid response sorties with preserving dozens of outposts from being overrun, though exact attribution remained difficult given the fog of night combat and language barriers in reporting. Each outpost represented 30 to 40 soldiers and their families living in adjacent hamlets, so the second-order effects extended beyond military metrics. When an outpost survived, the local population believed the government could protect them. When an outpost fell, the population hedged by supporting the Viet Cong. The F-100's contribution to pacification thus operated indirectly, not through destroying PAVN units, but through preventing PAVN units from demonstrating government impotence. This logic appeared repeatedly in MACV assessments of the RFPF program during 1968, though always with caveats about sustainability and dependency. The caveats proved accurate. When F-100 squadrons drew down in 1970 and 1971, RFPF losses increased proportionally. The dependency that air support created became the weakness it exploited when air support departed in 1967 and 1968, though the dependency held because the F-100s kept flying. The RF platoon near Fire Support Base 12 survived November 1967 because 2 Super Sabres arrived in under 10 minutes. Not independence, but presence. The perception shift began not in Washington or Saigon, but in the cockpits of O-1 Bird dogs orbiting Khe Sanh every morning at 0600 hours. Forward air controllers stopped requesting F-4 Phantoms and started requesting F-100 Super Sabres by tail number, because they knew which pilots could put a bomb inside a 50-meter error circle at 400 knots. The shift moved upward through the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force headquarters, then to 7th Air Force operations, then to Pacific Air Force's command briefs in Honolulu. By March 1968, the F-100 no longer appeared in the other sorties category. It got its own slide in the daily intelligence summary. The aircraft designed to intercept bombers over Kansas became the aircraft that defined close air support in Southeast Asia. The mission wrote the legacy, not the blueprint. The legacy of the F-100 Super Sabre in Southeast Asia rested not on kills confirmed or sorties flown, but on documented operational patterns. American and ARVN ground units with access to timely CAS from F-100 squadrons maintained defensive positions at substantially higher rates than units without such access during the critical November 1967 through April 1968 period. This pattern, evident in MACV command histories and the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force after-action reports, reflected the limits of available documentation rather than absolute claims. Weather, radio failures, and operational tempo all created gaps in coverage. Within the documented engagements, though, the pattern held presence correlated with survival. The F-100 achieved this not through technological superiority, but through operational availability. Arriving within 10 minutes and delivering ordnance within 100 meters of friendly forces because the pilots had flown the same mission 50 times before. Repetition became competency, competency became reliability, reliability became dependency. By February 1968, Marine rifle companies at Khe Sanh planned their daily patrols around F-100 coverage windows. moving only when fast movers were stacked overhead. The 26th Marines operations officer later wrote that his patrol schedules during the siege were dictated more by air availability than enemy activity, a reversal of doctrinal priorities that reflected the ground commander's reality. That reality was simple: PAVN forces attacked when air support was absent and hid when air support was present. The F-100's visible contrail overhead at 8,000 feet became a psychological weapon, signaling to PAVN observers that any advance would meet instant retaliation. The aircraft did not need to strike. It needed only to be seen. This deterrent effect multiplied the Super Sabre's tactical value beyond the tonnage it delivered. A single F-100 orbiting over Hill 881 South suppressed more PAVN activity than 5 F-100s striking after the assault began, because the overhead presence forced attackers to move slowly and carefully, consuming time and exposing them to ground fire. The operational concept was containment, not annihilation. Slow the enemy enough that ground forces could match him rather than destroy him outright. This approach suited the F-100's limitations. It could not loiter like an A-1, could not carry heavy ordnance like a B-52, and could not dogfight like an F-4. What it could do was appear quickly, strike accurately, and leave before ground fire found it. These three attributes, speed, accuracy, and survivability, defined the chaos envelope, and the F-100 fit that envelope better than any other aircraft in theater during 1967 and 1968. The comparison to the A-1 Sky Raider was instructive. The A-1 carried more ordnance, loitered longer, and could take more battle damage, yet ground commanders in our corps requested F-100s at higher rates. The preference reflected the time sensitivity of CAS. A perfect strike that arrived 15 minutes late was worthless. An adequate strike that arrived in 8 minutes saved lives. The F-100 consistently arrived in 8 minutes. The comparison to the F-4 Phantom was equally instructive. The F-4 flew faster, carried more bombs, and had 2 engines for redundancy. Yet it required longer turnaround times between sorties and more complex maintenance. During the Khe Sanh siege, the 26th Marines received more than 100 TAS sorties per day on average, a tempo that the F-100's lower operating cost and simpler logistics made sustainable. Lower operating costs enabled the Air Force to maintain sortie volume that would have been financially and logistically prohibitive with more complex aircraft. This cost efficiency was invisible to the Marines in the trenches, but it determined how many bombs landed near their position each day. The F-100 thus won the bureaucratic war that enabled the tactical war. The broader implication was that air support in limited conflicts operated under financial constraints absent in total war, and aircraft that fit those constraints mattered more than aircraft that maximized performance. The Super Sabre represented 1950s technology, delivering 1960s results because its design assumptions, single-engine simplicity, high-speed dash capability, and gun armament aligned accidentally with CAS mission requirements discovered a decade after the design was frozen. North American Aviation designed the F-100 to intercept bombers at altitude. The Air Force discovered it excelled at supporting infantry in valleys. This disconnect between design intent and operational use recurred throughout military aviation history, but rarely as completely as with the Super Sabre in Southeast Asia. The aircraft's success at CAS drove an unexpected consequence. By 1969, newer F-4 units arriving in theater received minimal CAS training because the assumption held that F-100 squadrons would handle the mission. When F-100 squadrons began drawing down in 1970, the F-4 units struggled to replicate the same strike accuracy under the same time constraints. Loss rates increased, fratricide incidents increased, and ground commanders complained about degraded air support quality. The degradation reflected not just aircraft differences, but the loss of accumulated pilot experience. By 1970, the veteran F-100 pilots with 200-plus sorties had rotated home, and their replacements in F-4s were starting from zero. The institutional knowledge built up over 3 years of sustained CAS operations evaporated in the transition. This knowledge included hundreds of informal techniques never codified in manuals: how to judge wind drift at 400 knots, how to compensate for humid air density, which ridgelines produced updrafts, which FACs gave, accurate briefs, and which ground units marked their positions properly. The F-100 pilots learned these details through repetition and shared them over beers in the officers' club at Phuket and Phan Rang. When the squadrons deactivated, the knowledge disappeared, cleared hot. The final F-100 CAS sortie in Southeast Asia occurred on 31st July 1971, when a Super Sabre from the 35th Tactical Fighter Wing struck a PAVN bunker complex near Firebase Fuller in Quang Tri Province. The pilot, a captain on his 197th mission, rolled in at 6,000 feet, pickled 2 Mk-82 bombs at 2,500 feet, and pulled off heading east. Both bombs impacted within 20 meters of the FAC's smoke mark. The firebase commander radioed, good hits, thanks for the help." The pilot acknowledged, climbed to cruise altitude, and flew back to Phan Rang, where his squadron was already packing equipment for redeployment to the United States. The F-100 exited the war the same way it entered, unremarked and essential. Between 1965 and 1971, F-100 squadrons logged approximately 360,000 combat sorties in Southeast Asia, with roughly 60% dedicated to CAS missions. The USAF lost 243 F-100s in combat during the war, a loss rate of 0.68 aircraft per 1,000 sorties, lower than the F-4's 0.74 rate and far lower than the A-1's 1.12 rate. The survival advantage came from speed. The F-100 spent less time in the threat envelope than slower aircraft. Pilot casualties mirrored aircraft losses. 186 F-100 pilots were killed in action, 71 were listed as missing, and 134 were captured and later repatriated. These numbers represented human costs embedded in sortie statistics, each loss leaving a gap in squadron rosters and families back in the United States. The costs were borne for a mission that received little public recognition because CAS did not produce dramatic imagery for evening news broadcasts. A fighter shooting down a MiG was news. A fighter dropping bombs 200 meters from Marines was routine. The routine was what mattered. The F-100's legacy was that it made CAS routine, transforming a specialized high-risk mission into a repeatable, schedulable operation that ground commanders could depend upon. This transformation required no technological breakthrough, no doctrinal revolution, and no dramatic innovation. It required only showing up every day, flying fast, and putting bombs close enough to matter. The Super Sabre did that for 6 years. In doing so, it defined the standard against which all subsequent CAS aircraft were measured: availability, speed, and precision under fire. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s as a dedicated CAS platform, explicitly incorporated lessons learned from F-100 operations: low-altitude maneuverability, built-in gun armament, and rapid turnaround times. The A-10's design owed more to the F-100's operational record than to any theoretical study of CAS requirements. Similarly, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller program that formalized FAC training in the 1990s codified procedures developed ad hoc by O-1 pilots and F-100 pilots over I-Corps during 1967 and 1968. The standardized targeting brief, the cleared hot phraseology, the danger close protocols, all emerged from Vietnam and all emerged from necessity, not doctrine. The F-100's contribution to this body of practical knowledge exceeded its contribution to enemy attrition. It taught the Air Force how to integrate with ground forces at the tempo ground combat demanded, rather than the tempo air operations preferred. That integration became doctrine, the doctrine became training, and the training became the muscle memory that allowed current generation pilots to execute CAS without conscious thought. The F-100 made CAS reflexive. This was the quiet legacy, the one that did not appear on memorial plaques or in official histories, but that persisted in every radio call between a FAC and a striker, every danger-close pass, and every Marine who survived because someone overhead was cleared hot. The aircraft everyone dismissed in 1966 as a disappointment became the aircraft ground commanders could not do without in 1968, not because it changed, but because the mission found it. Design intent faded. Mission need wrote the legacy. The perception break crystallized on 8 April 1968, when Operation Pegasus lifted the siege of Khe Sanh and journalists filed dispatches crediting Marine tenacity and air support for survival. The dispatches mentioned F-4 Phantoms and B-52 Arc-Light strikes, the weapon systems that fit the narrative of overwhelming American firepower. They mentioned the F-100 Super Sabre in passing, if at all. Yet in the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force Command debrief conducted at Gia Nang on 15th April, Colonel Lowndes listed CAS from F-100 squadrons as critically important in holding Khe Sanh, second only to the courage of his Marines. He noted that F-100s flew thousands of sorties during the siege, substantially more than F-4 or B-52 totals. The sortie ratio told the story. The war was sustained by the aircraft no one celebrated, not the aircraft everyone photographed. This pattern repeated across I-Corps and II Corps throughout 1968, Ground commanders requested F-100s, reporters photographed F-4s, and the public remembered the Phantoms. The misalignment between operational reality and public perception became complete when the Department of Defense released its annual summary of air operations in January 1969. The summary featured a photo of an F-4 launching from Da Nang on the cover and allocated 6 pages to air superiority missions over North Vietnam. Close air support received 2 pages, and the F-100 received 3 paragraphs within those 2 pages. The institutional memory of the war prioritized the missions that fit pre-war doctrine, air superiority, interdiction, strategic bombing, over the mission that actually consumed the most sorties. Historians later replicated this bias, focusing on Rolling Thunder and linebacker campaigns while treating CAS as a footnote. The bibliographic imbalance persisted. Far more books examined F-4 operations in Vietnam than F-100 operations, despite the Super Sabre flying comparable sortie totals. The legacy that mattered, though, was not the one preserved in books, but the one preserved in tactics, techniques, and procedures manuals. The F-100's CAS methods became the baseline against which later platforms were judged, and that baseline endured. By 1975, when the last American forces withdrew from Southeast Asia, the F-100 had been retired from active service, replaced by F-4s and A-7 Corsair IIs. The replacement aircraft were faster, carried more ordnance, and had better avionics. None replicated the F-100's operational tempo, the ability to fly 8 sorties per airframe per day and still launch within 10 minutes of a scramble call. That tempo, achieved through mechanical simplicity and logistical efficiency, remained unmatched until the A-10 Thunderbolt II entered service in 1976. The gap between 1971 and 1976 represented 5 years when the Air Force lacked an aircraft optimized for sustained high-tempo CAS. The gap closed only because the F-100's operational record convinced budget planners that a dedicated CAS platform justified development costs. The aircraft that was never supposed to fly CAS thus became the argument for building the aircraft that did nothing but CAS. This irony defined the F-100's story. Designed for one mission, essential for another, and remembered for neither. But every time a pilot rolled inverted over a contested hilltop and heard "cleared hot" over the radio, the Super Sabre's legacy spoke, not in words, but in the geometry of the dive, the discipline of the brief, and the knowledge that someone survived because someone arrived fast enough. The mission wrote the legacy. The F-100 Super Sabre wrote it in 400-knot passes over ridge lines that no longer appeared on maps. The Marines who lived through those passes remembered. That was legacy enough. The F-100 Super Sabre never became the interceptor North American aviation designed it to be, never shot down MiGs over Hanoi, and never fulfilled the air superiority role that justified its development in 1953. Instead, it flew 360,000 sorties at treetop altitude, delivering bombs within 100 meters of Marines who needed them yesterday. The aircraft proved that operational necessity rewrote design intent, that survival trumped doctrine, and that the machine that showed up mattered more than the machine that dominated performance charts. Mission need did not care about blueprints. Legacy was written in sorties flown, not specifications met. Design intent faded. Mission need wrote the legacy.